Hey girl gang, it's Dr. Joy here and you are watching Delivering Joy MDTV. Welcome to Well Woman Wednesday, where we have been talking about menopause, and today we are talking about the prequel or the start of menopause, and we're going to do the backstory today. And as you can see, I have a very special guest. Dr. Sicily is joining us, and she, y'all, is like a reproductive hormone specialist. So she's going to help us out today. She's going to be coming back to join us again to talk to us about some other stuff. But today I really wanted to cover how this whole story starts and how we actually start to make our eggs go through puberty, and how we start to have that change. You know, older people call it the change when you start going through menopause. And so how we really start to go through that change, and how our hormones start to decrease, and our reserve of eggs start to decrease, and how menopause actually starts, or that perimenopausal phase is what we tend to call it. So make sure you stay tuned, because we're going to be telling you some really important information, especially if you are hitting those 40s and early 50s. You definitely want to keep watching. All right, y'all. So we are back, and you can see that I'm probably on call today by my attire, but I am so grateful to Dr. Sicily for joining me. She is one of my favorite Morehouse School of Medicine alums, and I am just so glad to have her joining me today. She is a reproductive endocrinologist and infertility specialist, and these are a special breed of OBGYNs. I'd say they're the really smart versions of OBGYNs who specialize in reproductive hormones. Dr. Sicily went to the Morehouse School of Medicine, and then on to a 4-year residency program, and then an additional 3 years of reproductive endocrinology and infertility training. So she is highly qualified, more so than I, to discuss this with us today. Welcome, Dr. Sicily.
Thank you, Dr. Joy. I really appreciate that lovely introduction, and it's so great to spend this time with you. For those of you that don't know, Dr. Joy was my actually senior resident when I was a medical student at Morehouse School of Medicine, and she taught me so much about OBGYN, and it's one of the inspirations behind why I chose to go into this field. So it's really nice to be able to come back, spend time, and talk to you about all the things when it comes to the change. There's multiple changes we're going to talk about. I'm looking forward to talking about each of them with you today.
Well, thank you for saying that. She's so sweet. That's why I like her so much. So, Dr. Sicily, we are going to be talking over the next few weeks about menopause, and that is such a big time, I think, in a lot of women's lives, and a lot of women kind of just don't know a lot about it. I find that we, as women, sometimes have this whole, mystery surrounding the whole idea about our hormones and how our periods work and how menopause works as we age. And so I really wanted to see if you could just kind of talk to us a little bit about how all of this works. Like, I know as we are forming in our own mother's wombs, we have this whole process of oogenesis, or developing our eggs in our ovaries, and that whole process starts, and then there's puberty, and then there's this steady decline of our eggs and our hormones as we get older, and then finally menopause. So can you just kind of walk us through that process, starting at the very beginning?
Absolutely, and that couldn't be more correct. So certainly before we're ever formed in our mom's wombs, when we're being formed, at approximately 20 weeks of that gestation when we're being formed, so are our eggs inside of our ovaries. And ovaries are the organs that do two things. They make those eggs at that time, and they also store those eggs. And that's where the eggs are going to be stored for the rest of our reproductive life. In addition to making and storing eggs, the ovaries also make hormones. And so the ovaries really are the driving factor behind all of the things we're going to talk about today. That is egg development, egg loss, potential for pregnancy, menstruation, and menopause. It's all driven by the egg formation and the hormone formation that comes from the ovaries.
Okay, cool. So by the time we're about 20 weeks along inside of our mothers, we have made all the eggs that we're going to ever make.
That's correct. That
Wow.
number is approximately 7 million eggs at that time.
Whoa, 7 million. That's crazy.
Astonishing.
So that could potentially become like 7 million babies.
It could, except for by the time we're born, we have a sharp decline in those egg numbers and generally have around 1 million eggs at the time that we're actually born.
Okay, so we're down to 1 million by birth, and then we continue on to puberty, which I found, I don't know, and I'm sure in your practice you see this a lot, younger and younger puberty is starting at younger and younger ages. So I'm seeing girls 7, 8 years old who are starting puberty already.
That's correct. Generally, puberty is the changes that we go through when we have changes from the childhood to the adolescent stage in terms of our breast development. We're also going to be getting hair underneath our arms. We have growth spurts. And then for women, we have period begins. And so those are all the pubertal changes. And those things happen in response to the hormones being turned on by our ovaries. And we'll go into that more in detail in a little bit. Once those hormones are turned on, that's what starts to make all of those things, those changes happen in our bodies at that time. And certainly puberty is the hallmark of when we have another loss of eggs, around 400,000 eggs at the time of puberty. And the timing that puberty starts is different for every girl. And average, usually between the age of 10 to 12, but as you're mentioning, we are seeing it happening much earlier. And certainly I recommend that patients who are starting puberty before the age of 8 to definitely come see a doctor, because that's very early in starting puberty.
Right, absolutely. So we call that precocious puberty, when young girls are starting puberty very early, and we want to investigate that because that can be a real problem, particularly with regards to young girls not growing to their full potential, like their full height. So I think that's just fascinating that we have so many eggs in the beginning, and then we have such steep declines as we grow older, and not even like real old like me, but just, up to age 10 or 12, we're already down to 400,000 eggs from 7 million prior to birth. So that's crazy. So you talked about hormones turning on, and I kind of had a mental block in medical school about the whole brain to ovary feedback loop. I tried so hard to memorize it, and then I just never really understood it. So I think I might have been a resident before I really understood it well. But can you talk a little bit about how the brain and the ovaries work together to start that whole turning on of the hormonal feedback loop?
Yes. This is actually one of my favorite things about being a reproductive doctor is the hormones. It's really so exciting how these hormones contribute to so many changes that we experience in our lives. And so the brain has two major components, the hypothalamus and the pituitary. Both of those are structures that are going to be very important, and we'll talk about them more as we get through this process. But when I mention the brain, I'm talking about the hypothalamus and the pituitary. And the ovary itself has the function to make the hormones, primarily estrogen and progesterone. Those are the important hormones we'll talk about more as we go through. Generally, this all starts with the brain's production of a hormone called GnRH, which also stands for gonadotropin releasing hormone. And that comes from the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is also called the central regulator, the control center. It's the big place that everything kind of funnels through in the brain, and then things from there go and they make things happen. So the hypothalamus starts off this process with the GnRH release, the gonadotropin releasing hormone release. That hormone travels down through the brain into the base of the brain where it reaches the pituitary. And the pituitary is the regulator. The pituitary regulates then the response it gets from the hypothalamus, and it secretes two very important hormones. FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, which stands for luteinizing hormone. So in response to GnRH from the hypothalamus, the pituitary will then secrete those two hormones, FSH and LH.
Wow, and she's so smart, y'all. I love listening to her talk.
To make it very simple, GnRH is one hormone that can then control the production of two different hormones. And it's so fascinating because when GnRH does it not by changing itself, but just changing the speed or the rate that it's released. And so when GnRH is released in a very constant or straight pattern, you have absolutely no hormones being produced at all. That's what we usually see between birth and puberty, is that you're having this very steady, constant GnRH release. And in response to that, there's no hormones released from the pituitary gland, and you have no communication with the ovaries.
Wow, that is so cool.
Yes.
So just because it's like a steady, stable release of GnRH, you get no FSH or LH release. And so you don't have periods, you don't produce, you're not producing hormones from the ovaries yet. And it just stays steady and stable. But then when you hit puberty, it starts doing erratic things.
Erratic or making pulses.
Okay.
And those pulses actually are like waves in the ocean. So you're going to have peaks and troughs. But as it pulses, it then turns on the signaling from the pituitary gland to release the follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, which is the LH hormone.
Oh, okay. I got it now. So when your GnRH starts making motion in the ocean.
Yes.
Then you get your FSH and LH, and that starts your ovaries to activate.
Perfect.
Okay, all right. I wish you had been like the teacher when we were talking about this in med school. I think I would have gotten it.
Yes. And so one more layer is that in addition to the pulses, they can be slow motion or fast motion. And between the slow and the fast is how we differentiate between if we're going to be releasing the follicle stimulating hormone or the luteinizing hormone.
Okay. So which one is which?
So when we have a very fast wave, that's a follicle stimulating hormone that's going to be released from the pituitary. And when it slows down, it's actually luteinizing hormone that's released from the pituitary in response to that slower GnRH motion in the ocean from the hypothalamus.
Okay, that's cool. I can remember that because fast, FSH is the fast.
Yes.
Fast wave. And then when the waves, are slow, we get the LH.
Yes.
Got it.
Let's talk more about those two hormones that come from the pituitary. Okay. FSH stimulates follicles, and that's what it does. It makes follicles grow. Follicles are the area in the ovaries that the eggs grow. And so that's what we know that hormone controls is egg growth and development inside of a sac in the ovary called a follicle.
Okay, got it. And those often look like cysts, right? They look like cysts on ultrasound. So you can see the follicular cysts or functional cysts. Because I get a lot of people that are so concerned that someone saw a cyst on the ovary. And I spend a lot of time explaining that this is how you actually ovulate. And people are just so freaked out about that. Oh my God, I have a cyst on my ovary. And I'm like, oh no, it's a follicular cyst. And that's how you're going to release an egg.
That's correct. So a cyst, as you know, Dr. Joy, is something we see on ultrasound, and those are fluid-filled structures. And you can have lots of things. You can have all kinds of types of fluid inside the cyst. But a follicular cyst is a very special type of cyst that actually forms with an egg growing inside of it. And we watch those cysts grow in response to being stimulated by the FSH. And as they grow, they get big and big and bigger and bigger. They reach a really good size that we usually say is between 18 to 20 millimeters. And that's when we expect for them to have reached the point of having a very mature egg growing inside of that follicle.
Wow, that's pretty cool. So I remember us talking about that at one point, and you were telling me that at any given point when a woman's ovulating, that she may actually release multiple eggs. Like multiple eggs are called up, but only one becomes the dominant egg at most cycles. And the rest of those eggs are actually going to die off, right?
Yes. We talked about this before, and I think I call FSH the bring it out hormone. You know that song, bring it out,
Bring it out, bring it out. Yeah.
Yeah. So FSH actually brings out a group of follicles to grow. And that group is usually between 10 to 20 in size that we can actually visibly see. And that's also called your antral follicle count, or your AFC is how we often abbreviate that. From that follicle group, one is the one that becomes mature, and that be the biggest in that group, and that's the one that's released that month for pregnancy. The others in that group, and probably around 1,000 that we don't actually see on ultrasound, are lost that month, and we'll never see those eggs again.
Wow. So we lose about 1,000 eggs per month.
Yes.
So about 12,000 per year.
Yes.
Wow. So it makes perfect sense that by the time we, reach 45, 50, we're out, we're done.
Yes, certainly we have sharp declines in egg numbers starting from the age of 35 onward. And so by the age of 40, we've lost the majority of our eggs. In fact, most people by the age of 45 have very few eggs remaining in their ovaries. And pregnancy rates as a result of that have really gone down by the time we reach the age of 40 and 45.
Wow, that's crazy. So, our goal in telling this backstory is to kind of get to that perimenopausal state. I do want to kind of circle back before we get to that whole perimenopausal state and pick up that LH hormone, that partner to FSH, that when we have the slow waves of the GRNH pulses, and so that is the one that helps us release the egg when it's in the follicular cyst and it's already mature at that 18 to 20 millimeter size, right? So that's the one that says, pop the cyst, let the egg out.
Yes. So LH is luteinizing hormone, and that is the one that is responsible for ovulation. It actually responds to the follicle growing. As the follicle gets to that 18 millimeter size, where it has a mature egg, it's making estrogen. And the primary job of the estrogen is actually at this point to feed forward and to then say, I have a really mature egg inside. I'm making high levels of this hormone estrogen. Now it feeds forward. It talks back to the brain, tells the brain, I'm ready for this egg to be released and popped. And that's when we switch over from FSH to LH release. And LH comes from the brain to the ovaries and tells the ovaries, release this egg into the fallopian tube where it's able to be fertilized if there's sperm present.
Oh, this is going to be so good. So I have definitely got to get you to come back when we start talking about our fertility series. So yeah, because I have never really heard this explained so well. So I'm excited. I'm really geeking out on all this. So anyway, so now we understand our hormones, our GnRH, and we know how it's steady all the way from birth up until puberty, and then we start having our pulsatile function, the fast waves for FSH, which stimulates us to bring out the eggs, and then our slow waves for the LH, which stimulates the release of the egg. Actually, guys, I had that totally backwards. It's the slow wave for FSH and the fast wave for LH. And then we know that every month we probably are losing about 1,000 eggs each month. And by the time we hit 35, there's a steep decline in the egg reserve that we have left. And then by 40 or 45, we are pretty much getting to the end of our eggs. So around this time is when we're going to start to hit that perimenopausal phase. So now we kind of understand what's been happening up until this point. So now take us from this point, Dr. Sicily. What's happening now that we're almost out of eggs?
Yeah, I want to just add one piece, and that is that in response to the egg being released, the uterus actually, we haven't talked about the uterus at all yet, but it actually does respond to these hormones. And so as that egg is growing, the estrogen levels are the other thing they're doing is they're making that lining of the uterus nice and thick for pregnancy. Right. Once it's released in response to LH, if there's no pregnancy and that egg goes unfertilized, that lining sheds, and that is why we have a period.
Right. We definitely don't want to forget about the period. So
yes. And so the period is a vital sign for us.
Because it tells us whether or not the egg has been fertilized. Right. So if the egg has been fertilized, or I guess, I read a really startling statistic where nearly 30% of women may have had a fertilized egg when they start their cycle. Is that true? Or is that, I think I read it like in some throwaway magazine, but is that true?
Yeah, there's a very high rate of what we call biochemical or egg and sperm meeting fertilizing, but not actually sticking and causing pregnancies. And so because of that, just as a little bit more of the fertility component, because of that, only about 20% of the time when couples are trying for pregnancy, they're able to achieve pregnancy. Really, there are a high rate of pregnancies that don't actually stick. And so fertilization can happen without the egg actually sticking to the lining.
Interesting. So we can have a period even if we did have a fertilized egg, but just for the purposes of this conversation, if the lining sheds off, we can say that's a vital sign to say that we haven't had a resulting pregnancy.
Absolutely. And so as you've kind of alluded to, the perimenopausal period is when we have started to see changes in our hormones. And in response to changes in our menstrual cycle. And that's why I wanted to go back and talk about the uterus and how the menstrual cycle happens, because we do start to see changes in the menstrual cycle happening, but they're not happening as regular as they used to be.
Okay, so changes in the menstrual cycle are happening for sure. And so as we are no longer having that full normal ovulatory cycle, we may also see changes in the way that lining is shedding off.
Absolutely.
So I'll often see perimenopausal folks coming in and saying, my periods aren't coming as normal as I'll often see perimenopausal folks coming in saying, I'm not having periods as often, or my periods are not lasting as long as they were before, or my periods are heavier. Or they're longer. So we start to see those changes occurring as the hormonal balance is changing.
Yes. And so in response to having those lower egg numbers in the ovaries, as you can imagine, the ovaries are making lower levels of the hormones that they make. And those hormones, estrogen and progesterone, are the ones that are driving the menstrual cycle and the period. And all the things you've talked about, the menstrual cycle can become shorter, it can become longer, can become irregular, they can become heavy. All of those things are things that we can see in the perimenopausal period. And I think it's important to note, Dr. Joy, that periods normally should be between 21 and 35 days. When we start to get out of those ranges, that's what we commonly see in the perimenopausal period, of having very short cycles or longer cycles. And that's all a response to having having irregular release of the eggs from the ovaries.
Okay, that makes total sense. So, I think that's a big concern for perimenopausal women, is like the big changes in their menstrual cycles. And honestly, it really becomes a real issue, and they're very concerned about, okay, well, is this ever going to stop? You know, are my periods going to be heavy like this forever, or are they going to be irregular like this forever? And it's a big cause for women seeking surgical procedures, hysterectomy or ablation, or maybe wanting to be placed on hormone therapy. So obviously really heavy periods are never normal, but you can certainly see them around the time of perimenopause for sure, for the reasons that you just mentioned to us. So nothing that's unexpected, but certainly something that should be treated if you find that you're, bleeding very, very heavily, or your periods are lasting for a really long, longer than 7-day intervals.
Yes. I would encourage anyone who's going through this time period definitely to see an OB/GYN, and certainly these things are very common, but we want to make sure there's nothing else that can be contributing to having your periods changing. That can be other things in the uterus, like fibroids can cause these kinds of things. You can have polyps. There can also be other hormonal problems like the thyroid or the prolactin. Those are other things that come from the brain that can also cause us to have these irregular periods. And let's not forget, even if we are at low egg numbers, we can still become pregnant at this stage of our lives. And so it's important for us to make sure that we do see a doctor for having these periods that become changing for us, and find out why they're changing, and be reassured if we find out that it's because of this, what we call anovulatory period of the perimenopause.
Absolutely. And you can see I linked my playlist for abnormal bleeding up here. So there are lots of different causes that could be the case. And we certainly want to root out any other causes before we just chalk it all up to perimenopausal bleeding, because we want to make sure that you are doing okay. And even if it is perimenopausal bleeding, there are options to treat it. So if you're losing more blood than you should be, and I like to pull out those measuring cups. If you're one of my girl gang, if you're losing more blood than you should be, we want to make sure that you're safe and that you're staying healthy. So that's very important. So, Dr. Sicily, can you talk to us a little bit about some of the other symptoms besides just abnormal bleeding? Because I am seeing lots of women who are having hot flashes or hot flushes, which is really the proper term, but we all say hot flashes here in the South. And then, sometimes night sweats, mood swings, vaginal dryness, like all sorts of things that are going on in this perimenopausal phase.
Yes, you've mentioned them all. We'll take them one at a time, and they're all related to the changes in the hormone production from the ovaries. I'll start with vaginal dryness, actually, because that actually comes in response to having low levels of estrogen. Estrogen is a very important hormone. It's the one that thickens the lining for pregnancy, but it also does give the moisture to the vagina. And so as we get lower levels of estrogen and from the ovaries being produced, the vagina has less moisture, and that's what causes vaginal dryness, which can cause discomfort during intercourse. You can also have a lot of symptoms of either recurrent infections, as the vagina no longer has its normal moisture and normal bacterial composition. So those are things we see very commonly in people that are perimenopausal when it comes to the vaginal dryness associated with having low levels of estrogen. You mentioned the hot flashes, and the hot flashes are also something that we see in response to having changes in your estrogen levels. Remember, the brain talks to the ovary. Well, the ovary also talks back. This is important. I know talking back is not something we like to do here in the South, but when it comes to our bodies, it's important that our ovaries are talking back to our brain, telling our brain, I got the message. And so when that level gets very low and we're not making a lot of estrogen, the brain recognizes that, and it actually interferes with the thermoregulatory center in the brain, which is close to the hypothalamus we talked about already. And so as you can imagine, it interferes with that center. And so your brain has lost the ability to really give you normal cooling like it's supposed to. And so you can be feeling very, very, very hot, and everyone else feels fine. That's a hot flush.
Oh, wow.
Okay. You are just taking off clothes and why is it so hot in here and fanning yourself, having a personal summer, and everyone else feels like it's just a nice fall day. And that is what people experience when they experience hot flushes. You can imagine how disruptive that is to your life. If you're the only one that feels warm, you can imagine how hard it is to be able to be comfortable in social settings and also work settings when you're having hot flushes.
Absolutely, for sure. And many women are like, oh my gosh, it is so almost debilitating, especially, at work or when they're out socially. And it's to the point where sometimes they, feel like they're not able to complete a work day. Without wanting to rip off all their clothes. So definitely more to come. We're going to explore these and some tips and tricks on how to deal with them, and also some treatment options that are available. So that'll be next week. So make sure you stay tuned and subscribe. And then, definitely night sweats and difficulty sleeping are another big deal. So what's up with that?
Very similar to the hot flushes. So it's also the thermoregulatory center in the brain is not working normally. And so thermo is, heat, and regulation is the control of that heat. And so at nighttime, you can have that same response where you just end up getting much, much hotter than you would normally get. And so the normal cooling mechanisms that your brain would establish to keep you nice and cool at night aren't there. And you will have sweating, and it's intense sweating, so intense that your entire night gown or your pajamas or your bed sheets can be completely soaked from that sweating episode. And so that is very disruptive to sleep. Already we have sleep disturbances happening because of the brain changes that are happening in the perimenopausal period. On top of that, in an additive fashion, you have now, sometimes you're waking up completely soaked and having to change your sheets or change the garments you're wearing at nighttime to sleep. And that's incredibly disruptive to having a good night's sleep in this period.
Yeah, absolutely. I would so agree with that. And then with the mood swings, I, have been reading a lot about how estrogen can, or the lack of estrogen can certainly play a role in the reduction of some of the chemicals in our brain that are important to stabilize our mood. And it can even play a role in having brain fog and memory loss. So it just seems like estrogen is such a big deal for our body. So when you're talking to these people who are going through perimenopause and menopause, do you recommend putting everybody on hormones?
I'm a hormone specialist, and so I really do enjoy hormones. And I think that hormones, as you mentioned, estrogen is a very big component of what makes people that are born with ovaries and a uterus so incredibly special in terms of the things it does for us. It's good for our brain. It's good for our bones. It's good for our heart. It's good for the vagina. It's good for so much of our daily being. But what I will tell you is that everybody that's going through these symptoms does not need to be on hormone replacement therapy.
She's smart. I see. She's smart. So I totally agree. I don't think it's for everybody. But I think that there's certainly a group of folks that really benefit from hormone replacement therapy. So when you're looking at women who are having these symptoms, who is your ideal candidate for hormone replacement therapy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the ideal candidate, number one, is someone who's really bothered by their symptoms is the first starting point, meaning that they find them disruptive. So if you are trying things that are not working, or if you find that it's not able to do your daily activities, whether that's work related or socially, those are things you want to talk to your doctor about. Are there options available for me that I can use that can help reduce these symptoms? Number two is somebody who is relatively close to the time of menopause. Generally, we don't like to do this too far removed from menopause because there's a certain time frame that we've shown to find it most beneficial when you're around the time of menopause in general. That's on average around the age of 51 to 52 in America. Another good candidate is someone who has tried alternative methods. So they've tried things like vaginal lubrication. They've tried the cooling blankets at night. They've tried to keep the room a little bit cooler, and they don't receive a response. They're still having symptoms that are disturbing despite those things. Other good candidates are people who don't have ovaries. So for some reason they've had their ovary removed due to some surgical procedure. Those are good candidates for also hormone replacement therapy because they need the replacement that they are missing from their own ovaries making those hormones.
Absolutely. And one thing I also counsel patients about is folks who don't have a pre-existing medical condition that would be contraindicated for hormone replacement therapy. Like if you've had blood clots in your legs or lungs, or if you're over the age of 35 and you're a smoker, or if you have heart disease, or you've had personal history of breast cancer that was estrogen receptor positive or something. So there are lots of caveats that go on with hormone replacement therapy. And like you said, age has plays a role in whether or not hormone replacement therapy is safe for you. And family history plays a role in whether or not hormone replacement is safe for you. So that's a question I get a lot from patients that I see, and I say, well, it really needs to be an individualized consideration for every person, because hormone replacement is not for everyone. It's not a safe option for everyone, and it's not the best option for everyone. So don't just think, oh, well, if my hormones are low, I should just get on hormones, because it may not be the best option for you. There are other options that are non-hormonal that may be better fit for you based on your medical history, your family history, and what your symptoms are. So I think this has just been such a robust and wonderful discussion. Thank you so much, Dr. Sicily, for being willing to talk to me about this and for teaching me some things. It's so great when you have a student that becomes your teacher. That everyone that you touch should surpass you. And that's just such an example of what Dr. Sicily has done. She has surpassed me in her learning, and now she's able to come back and teach me something.
Well, we are all learning always, and that's the benefit of being in this field, is that we're always lifelong learners. And I'm very grateful for all that you've taught me, and I am very, very fortunate to be able to still be connected with you and be able to have these discussions. And as we learn together and teach everybody else the things that are so important about their bodies and about how the bodies work.
So I hope that you enjoyed this discussion. We will definitely have Dr. Sicily back to talk to us about more things, especially when we start talking about infertility, because that is another one of her specialties, along with hormones. Please put your comments and questions below. We would love to talk to you more about this subject, and I'll be back soon talking more about some of the individual topics and symptoms that we talked about with menopause. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss a single Well Woman Wednesday. We'll catch you next Wednesday, girl gang. Peace.